a senior developer at Previous Next, primarily based in Perth, but we've got offices mainly in Sydney, Melbourne, and here in Canberra. If you want to get me, feel free to flick me an email. I'll probably upload the slides later. IRC is probably the best bet. My IRC name's the same as my Drupal.org username. I'm in there way too often, so you can get me pretty much 15 hours a day. So quick overview, we're going to have a bit of a look at why Migrate was successful in Drupal 7, why people were using it and what kind of led people to use Migrate. From there we'll have a look at the decision and why we decided to bring Migrate into Drupal 8 Core. I might just wait a second, there's a late flurry. So we'll go through bringing Migrate into Core, then we're going to have a look at the architecture of the Migrate API in Drupal 8 Core. It's a little bit different from Drupal 7, but again, not that much different if you're really experienced with the Drupal 7 module. Then we'll look at Migrate and Contrib. A lot of things got broken up, a bit more granular now. Some stuff didn't make it into Core just because the quality of things that come into Core is a lot higher, or the use case has to be high for it to be in the Core Drupal, so a lot more stuff got moved into different parts of Contrib. And then finally we'll look at the future of Migrate, which is just a quick overview of what's coming next, 8.1, 8.2, because right now Migrate's in experimental status as far as Drupal core is concerned. So Migrate in Drupal 7, I think one of the primary reasons it was successful is if you've ever upgraded Drupal from one version to another version, you probably understand the pain as to why Migrate was successful. In Drupal 5, 6, they had like an update.php script, and it was this whole process where you've got a Drupal 6 site and you've got a Drupal 6 database and you've been in production for years, and then you want to move to Drupal 7. So how do you do that? You use update.php, and it's this upgrade path that's in core that essentially will turn your Drupal 6 site into an exact replica Drupal 7 site. And it just wasn't that stable. It worked on an out-of-the-box installation. You install Drupal 6 right now, you run update.php, sure, you'll probably have a Drupal 7 site. But once you've kind of been in production, you've got hundreds of contrib modules, custom code, custom database tables, all that kind of stuff. The upgrade path didn't really work for you. So people started looking at other solutions. The Migrate API allowed you to just move the content that you wanted to move from your legacy site and put that into your new site. Another great benefit of that is, say a site's in production 3, 4, 5 years, the chances are you've learned, or you should have learned as a developer, a better way to probably structure that data model. And the chances are the business or the website's purpose has also changed a little bit as well. So you want to have a look at maybe consolidating content types, breaking things out, even splitting into multiple sites, all of this kind of stuff. So the Migrate API really opened that up, and people just never really used the upgrade path. It was a very small percentage of people, and maybe non-technical people, who were just trying to upgrade it. If you're using Bartik for your blog, you might have been okay. And I think the last part that made the API successful was it was just a really good API for pulling data and then saving it into Drupal. So you didn't necessarily have to be talking about a one-time migration where I'm going to upgrade my Drupal 6 site to Drupal 7. What about if you have a Drupal 7 site and there's some remote API and you want to consume like a feed of data and you want to do that once a day, and you're just pulling in this CSV data or you're pulling in some JSON feed, things like that. The Migrate API had all of the right tools for that. It had a bit of a framework for parsing that data in, had a bit of a framework for keeping track of what data you'd already pulled into what data was saved in Drupal, and it allowed you to do incremental migrations. So I've used the Migrate API in Drupal 7 many times as essentially an API integration between another data feed, keeping websites in sync, things like that. So that made it really a popular API in Drupal 7. Later on in the Drupal 8 release cycle, they decided, because of some of the pains I mentioned about for the users using that update path, it was also very difficult to develop. It was one of the biggest pain points for Drupal 7. After Drupal 7 came out, it was nearly a solid 6 months of debugging and support to get the upgrade path to be where it needed to be. And the upgrade path bugs were so bad that we actually fixed the very last one to get Drupal 8 out of the door. Because of the short support that Drupal 6 is now getting, it was agreed that we should fix the final upgrade path bugs from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7 before we release Drupal 8, just to not leave people, kind of stranded on Drupal 6. So migrating core, like I said, it was split up quite a lot. In Drupal 7, there was just the migrate module, and it had a sub-module called migrate UI. But other than that, a lot of it was all just in there. So this is where it kind of got split up to. So the core migrate API came into core Drupal, and it came in pretty much wholesale, but it has since evolved a lot, and we're going to talk about how the API has developed a bit since then. Migrate D to D is a key module. I mentioned that from Contrib in Drupal 7 because that also came into core. So the idea was we'll replace the upgrade path and we'll replace it with a migration path. And that's what Migrate D to D did in Contrib for Drupal 7. It provided sources for Drupal 6 and Drupal 5, and there might even be some Drupal 4.7 sources out there as well. So that's come into Drupal core now, and that's called Migrate Drupal. And in core, we've got a standard D7 upgrade path. Migrate, again, that got split out. The UI component went into Migrate UI. We're going to talk about all of these modules in a bit, so I won't go into detail. Migrate went into Migrate Plus as well, so that some of the Drush stuff, things like that, they've gone into this module. And then all of the sources got split out, so they were all piled into the one Migrate module in Contrib, and they've all been separated as well. Big reason for separating some of these things like the UI and the Migrate module is when you're using the Migrate module, like I talked about before, to consume APIs, you want to leave the bare minimum amount of modules on in production. You don't necessarily want all of the UI enabled on a live server. You really only need the API modules that are scraping the data in and saving it into Drupal. So this was part of that process, as well as, like I mentioned before, splitting it up and just bringing the core API into core. So we're going to have a bit of a look at the architecture overview in core, and I am a developer, so I'll try not to get too technical. I know there's probably a few people here who are developers, but I want to talk about the architecture at a high level and try and give you a bit of an idea of what these APIs are there to achieve. So hopefully, if you're not a developer, you can still kind of connect the dots of, oh, these APIs would help me do this business problem or solve this problem. So Migrate follows a design pattern called ETL, that's extract, transform, load. It's a pretty common pattern outside of the Drupal ecosystem. Some of you developers might have heard of that already. Then we're going to have a bit of a look at the ID map, the Migrate executable. These are some of the interfaces and tools that are available in the API. And then we'll have a look at how how the migration API kind of matches up to some core concepts, if you will. So migrations are config entities, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll have a look at templates and builders, which are homegrown migration solutions to some problems that we had in D8 core. And in the later part of the presentation where we talk about the future of Migrate, we'll mention how they might be going away. So a source plugin, the source plugin is responsible for extracting the data. That's where the E comes from. Extracting the data from wherever you're coming from. So some people call it source data. You might call it legacy data. But it's really the source plugin is the thing that you're going to write that interprets wherever you're at today. So if you're on Drupal 5, then you're going to have Drupal 5 source plugins. If you're on WordPress, then you're going to have WordPress source plugins. And this is the very start of where the migration pipeline begins. And we're going to talk about this whole concept of a pipeline as we go through these next few slides. And you can write a source plugin for pretty much anything. I've written them for static HTML files. You can truly parse them for anything. There's just some examples of common platforms. All of the common ones already exist. They did exist in Drupal 7. And they already exist for Drupal 8. The Drupal ones definitely do. The XML, JSON, CSV, they're all available. So if you're wanting to migrate for one of them formats, the chances are a lot of the work is already done for you. Sources in Drupal 7, the way they worked, they were kind of built into the migration class itself. And a lot of people, the way they extended them is they might just extend the source plugin or something like that. And the way that was all overridden was quite messy. You ended up with these thousands of lines of code where people were doing custom processing on the data that had come in from the source, so they were doing all the cleanup of the data essentially, or they were doing all the aggregating of the data. That all lived in source plugins, and what that led to was quite a messy API, and that's been one of the key things that's separated out in Drupal 8 core, and they've been separated out into what we call process plugins. So process plugins, they map to transform. So this is the part of the pipeline, and it's the second stage where you can transform your data. So you can transform that source data, and you can transform it into whatever you need to lead on to the destination. So these can be used for all kinds of simple manipulations. There's some examples there like flatten and concat, where you could take an array of data, you can flatten it, or you could concat two strings together. If you had a first name and a last name field in your legacy data, you realize that that doesn't actually cover how people like to enter their name, so you're just going to put one text field for name now. You can do all of these things, and they just concat them together. But the best thing about process plugins, the self-contained transformations now. In Drupal 7, like I said, they'd all be in your migration class in a function like preparer. Most people who've used the API have done it. And it made it very difficult to reuse that code or understand that business logic, because a lot of this stuff is the business logic of what you're doing with the data as you bring it across. And it just grew and grew and grew, and it was out of control. Now that they're self-contained, they're reusable across migrations, and they're fully unit testable. So you can write these process plugins once, and they'll handle transforming one bit of data into another bit. You can test that that works. And if you've got 10, 15, 20 migrations, especially good if you're, again, consuming APIs and you're doing the same transformations, that's now fully testable. So that is a really big win and a big part of cleaning up the whole API from where it was in D7. And destinations. So destinations in ETL map to LERD. LERD in Drupal has a different meaning, which is kind of confusing. Drupal, nerd LERD, entity LERD, we think about LERDing something out. Everywhere else, programming tends to refer to LERDing something in, so that's why ETL stands for LERD in that. And we call them destinations, the same as we did in Drupal 7. Now, what the destination is responsible for is it's the third part of the pipeline. You've got the data, you've transformed it. The destination understands Drupal 8 APIs, and it's responsible for saving to Drupal 8. It's important, I should probably note, that the sources, they should never ever talk to Drupal 8. A source, that's only responsible for understanding the legacy data format. If you ever find yourself querying the Drupal 8 database in a source, then really you've broken the encapsulation of the API. The destinations are there to make it easy for you to save that information into Drupal, regardless of where you came from. It doesn't matter if you're coming from WordPress or Drupal 6 or static files, destinations are always the same, and they always do the same job, and that is they take the data and they save it into Drupal. Because of that, you should never really have to write a custom destination. In Drupal 7, it was common sometimes to have custom tables, right? Like you would do that, hook schema, and you'd be creating custom tables to create custom data storage solutions. That's just not the way in Drupal 8. Drupal 8 has got a complete entity API. The configuration API is much improved. You should be replicating your data from your legacy into one of the available APIs, and therefore the destinations that you need to save that data, they already exist. If you think you need a new destination, probably think again, talk to somebody before you do it. So migrations as config entities. Config entities, I won't delve into that. If you're a developer, you probably already have a bit of an idea. It's a new Drupal 8 concept. But the key thing that I want to kind of point out here is in Drupal 7, we used to do the mappings between the source data and the destination data, like the fields where what's going where. That was all happening in PHP, and it was all in a developer kind of way. And people would use Excel files to try and understand what's going where, and then all of that stuff gets translated into PHP. With Drupal 8, the syntax is a YAML file, and that there is a configuration entity, but it's just a simple YAML file, and anybody could really read that. They're easy to handwrite, and it's pretty straightforward. It just shows you the source fields and how they map to the destination fields. So it's pretty trivial for you to write them, and you could even show them to a client, or you could copy it out and you can almost get the information that you would have from an Excel file straight away. The other great thing is they're exportable via the configuration system. So again, if you know the whole kind of thing with config and being able to deploy it in Drupal 8, if you make some changes to your migration, you can just commit that and you can just push it out and it'll automatically deploy to you, via your normal channels, all via the config system. So the ID map, this is a little bit of a technical thing, but I think it's worth mentioning because this is how a lot of the magic happens really with Migrate. What the ID map does is every piece of data that comes from somewhere else, your source, your legacy data, that has to have a unique ID. If it doesn't have an ID, you probably have to come up with one as part of importing that process because you really need a unique identifier for every row of information. And when we store it into Drupal, we also need to have a unique ID, and obviously Drupal will generate those IDs for us. So what the ID map does is simple. It provides an ID map from the source data to the destination data. But that's really important because when you run the first migration, it builds the ID map, and if it's an upgrade path, then that's almost irrelevant. If you run it once, then it's gone. You'll never need the ID map tables. But if, for example, something goes wrong and you want to try and run it again, or you want to roll it back, the ID map is like the manifest of information that it can use to decide which entities to now delete when it rolls back. Or if you want to run an update and you run it again from an API, it can use this table to figure out what data is new and what not to update versus what to update. It's a bit of a technical detail, but it is a very important part of the API. So the Migrate executable, now this is essentially like the interface for Contrib and the tools that you use to run migrations. If every developer was going to run their own migrations, they would have to use the previous concepts that we taught. They'd get the sources, they'd use them to get the source data, then they'd get the process plugins and they'd get them to do the transformations, and then they'd get the destinations to save the data for you. And every developer would find himself doing them same three things and sticking it together. So Migrate executable essentially provides like a facade, which is a simplified version of doing them steps. With a bit of clever kind of built in, it does things like recovering memory for you if you're doing a really big import, you're importing millions of records. It handles all of them kind of things. Also fires a lot of key events, all of the counters and the statistics that you get during the migration and stuff like that. They're all powered now based on events that the Migrate executable fires at key points, before it saves a row, after it saves a row, if there's errors, all that kind of stuff. And it's, like I said, it's the primary interface for all of the runners that we're going to move into in a minute. So migration templates, this is was designed, it's specific to Migrate this. Some of you might have seen it. But what these migration templates, the reason they came about was migrations are config entities, or that's what I just told you, but they changed into migration templates because when you enable the Migrate module, the core developers didn't want to have 1, 2, 3, 400 configuration entities instantly imported into Drupal. When you're exporting that information and deploying it, by enabling one module, you've probably just quadrupled the size of data that you're now managing in configuration. And most people aren't using any of those migrations, you might only be using a handful of them. So what they decided to do was move the config entity YAML files into another folder where they wouldn't automatically be discovered, and they called them migration templates. So a migration template, in most cases, is identical to the YAML that you would get in a configuration entity. You could copy that file in 90% of the cases into the active store in your Drupal site, and then you would have a migration where you could migrate your nodes or your users, things like that. The one place where they differ is migration builders. So one of the problems that you can imagine with a static YAML file is you don't always know the format of the source data until you actually come to running your migration. So, I showed you in the YAML file before, there was the source values on the left and they map to a hard-coded list of values on the right, and that's the source fields and then the destination fields. Well, in Drupal, because it's such a flexible system, there's an unknown amount of content types. You know, some people might have an event content type, some people might have a blog, and each one of those content types might have a different amount of fields, right? Some people might have 10 fields on the event, and some people might only have 5. And we don't know that, so how do we build the YAML file that represents a migration for your specific use case? So that's where migration builders come in. They take the template, which is the YAML file, and they use plugins. Plugin is another Drupal concept we won't go into, but they use a builder plugin, and that can connect to your source database and generate migrations for you, so dynamic migrations. So it will dynamically generate end migrations from the node migration for you. So you'll give it the node.d6 YAML file, and it'll spit out page :node, you know, story :node for each one of your bundles. The great thing about that is you now have a static YAML file that represents your specific situation, and you can have a look at those files and debug those files before you actually come to running the migrations. Anyone who was involved in Drupal 8 but just before RC, like beta stage, this concept used to be called load entities. So if you're wondering where that's gone, we replaced load entities because that process that I just described of generating the YAML file, that used to happen on the fly. And as you can imagine, that was a lot more difficult to debug if the generating of the migration and then the running all happened at the same time. If anything went wrong during that process, it was a lot harder to debug. Okay, so now we're going to have a quick look about Migrate Upgrade. That's the module that's going to come into core. Then we're going to look at Migrate UIs, Migrate Plus, and how they extend the core Migrate modules. Just have a brief look at some of the additional sources, and then we'll look at a couple of the other runners. And finally, a bit of stuff for you guys who maintain your own contrib modules, how you might write your own migrations, and how you might test those migrations as well. So Migrate Upgrade, now this, going back to the upgrade path that was in Drupal 7, it had a UI, and you could go to this page, update.php, and just hit a button and get a nice progress bar, and then watch it blow up. But you know, you got the idea. You did get a UI. So that's one of the reasons that Migrate went into Drupal core as an experimental module, because the UI wasn't ready for the 8.0 release, and I'm sure many of you are aware they were they were rushing to get this thing done, and we just didn't have time to complete it. But Migrate Upgrade will probably be in 8.1, if not, it'll definitely be in 8.2. But this replaces update.php. It provides the user interface for those of you who want to just upgrade wholesale from an exact replica of your D6 site or D7 straight into Drupal 8. And this is what it does. It's a little bit more advanced than update.php. There's a 2-step wizard, and what that'll do is it'll show you migrations that'll be missing. So if you had the book module on Drupal 6, you need to enable the book module in Drupal 8 for those migrations to be available. And that second step there is giving you a bit of an overview where it's saying, by the way, this upgrade path is available if you update this module. It'll also tell you when they're not available. So if you're using some contrib modules, you're using organic groups or something like that, no upgrade paths available at the moment. It'll say anything to do with organic groups, unfortunately, is not going to come across. You know, that configuration, those migration paths, they don't exist. So it'll give you all of that warning up front. Bit hard to see there. But Migrate sources, again, like I said, they've been split out into individual projects. I don't know whether that should probably be straightforward to you. CSV is like an Excel file if you're migrating from that. XML, JSON, they're just other data formats. So these are generic sources that you can use with any data that's in one of those formats. The other good thing is they're really simple sources. So if you do need to write a custom source that, you know, if I was going to write one today that was going to pass a static HTML file because you've got this really old site, probably a really good example of looking at a source away from core that's, you know, like the bare minimum that you need to go ahead and develop a source. There is a bit of a discussion about them going back into Migrate Plus, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen at this point. So Migrate UI, so I built this for Drupal 8, and it provides a subset of the user interface functionality that was in Drupal 7. That YAML file that I showed you before that represents a configuration entity, this is the user interface that basically represents that exactly. So you can change the field mappings, you can change the source data. It's all editable from the UI. It'll show you a list of the active migrations, not the templates, the ones that have been imported already, and it'll allow you to change those migrations or customize those migrations as you need. And they're all changed straight into the active store so they can be exported and deployed to your site. This is probably a really handy tool if you do have, non-technical people as well and possibly involved in the migration process. I said the YAML file was readable, which it is, but this is even better again. It gives a bit of a user interface and people can see, the created timestamp is going into this timestamp now, and you can do things like that. You can also do more advanced stuff. So the processing, which is what we talked about before, the transforming of data, that also happens in a pipeline. So you can run in a linear fashion multiple processing of the data. And this allows you to configure that. So if you wanted to stick two pieces of data together and then do something else to it, you can set all of that up. So you can almost control, what you're doing with the data from the UI before you run the migration. Last bit, that gives you a bit of a UI for templates. So like I said before, there's no way that they can be discovered in core. So Migrate UI fills that gap. That gives you a list of templates, and that allows you to convert that template into a migration that can then be run. Migrate API, getting short on time, so that is like, for those of you developers, that's like C tools for Migrate. It's where a lot of the experimental code is going to be going. A lot of developer tools for those of you who are kind of maybe building more like Migrate contrib solutions. Migrate Plus, this is where a lot of the other core functionality from the Drupal 7 module has gone. The Drush commands are there, which allow you to run the migrations. And there's a few other concepts in there, like the dashboards there that you would have recognized with the UI runner from Drupal 7. And there's also migration groups. They allow you to share configuration between different migrations. Migrate Manifest, this is great for those of you who are like running, if you've got a massive data set, you probably don't want to be waiting to run this migration all the time, but during development you need to keep pulling in the fresh data. This allows you to just put together a manifest file of the migrations you want to run, then your CI product, whatever it is, can just run that migration overnight. I know a few people building big install profiles, whether it's 15 hours to get that migration to run, so they just let it run overnight. This is a great way to track what migrations are run, track it all in source control. I actually built that initially, but someone else has taken it over since then. Okay, so writing migrations in contrib. If you're a contrib developer, if you were storing data on your own in Drupal 7, custom tables, variable gets, things like that, then you're going to be responsible for writing migrations into Migrate templates. If you just want to manipulate, if you used to store your data alongside other people's data, like on field format settings or something like that, you tried to extend other people's data, hook migrate load alter is how you're going to do that. That allows you to hook in during the migration of running, and that allows you to change how the migration behaves specific to support your contrib module. I'm not going to go into any more detail because we're running short on time, but CCK field plugins, anyone who maintains their own custom field types in contrib, that's available. Again, testing migrations, this wasn't really possible in Drupal 7 at all, but it's really important for big migrations, big projects where requirements are changing during development. A lot of people fall trapped to developing the migrations at some point, and then the site doesn't go live for 6 months. And 3 weeks before everything changes. So testing migrations is really important, and I'll just leave that on the slides. You can get the slides later, but you can now generate fixtures like a subset of your source data, and then you can begin to test your migrations against actual real data and how they're going to, what the outcome will be before you even run the full migration. So they're really good tools, and there's a lot of effort put into making that tool set work in core. Finally, future migrations. Migrations are looking at moving over to the plugin API. So migrations themselves might become plugins. maybe 8.1 again, but probably 8.2 at this point. And the advanced building of the migration config entities, I specifically showed you the UI where you could build a template into a migration. That doesn't currently support the advanced version where you have to connect to the source data and work out what fields are there. That'll be coming in the next couple of months as well. Demo, not going to do that, we don't have time, but there is a demo there on the slides. I'll upload them later and you can watch. There's a bit of a demo of the upgrade UI. Great. That's it. Questions? Yep.
Just a quick one. Awesome work, by the way. I've been using Migrate for D8 from D6.
Great.
One minor issue I ran into, which was due to bad data in the D6 site, was the link migration, where previous links, some of them had a schema, some of them didn't. So therefore, while they migrated perfectly fine, once you did the search index exception, it went bad. The way that I approached it was I simply extended the particular destination plugin and just put in a little bit to clean up the data. Is there a better way?
Yeah, so that is so that's not the best place to hook in. The best place would be to the hook that I showed you there, that alters the migration, and then you can shim in your own process plugins. So that's a perfect example where you would write a process plugin that handled your old links and all the different messes that you had essentially into what you want it to be. And you can test that in isolation, and then you can just hook it into the migration at the process layer, and all of that would have just worked.
In the Drupal 7 version of Migrate, you have a destination for nodes, terms, and users. And if a module implemented its own entity and they didn't define a destination, you had to write it yourself. But you said with Drupal 8, if you're writing a destination, you're doing it wrong.
Yep.
Does the destination now handle just entities?
Yes. So it's generic to entities, and it uses the plugin derivative system. So you can implement more specific destinations if you need to, but the general use case, entities are solved, configs also solved. Great, thank you.